is Chapter 14 on the Autonomic Nervous System. So the autonomic nervous system is sometimes also called the involuntary system or the general visceral motor system. So it's basically all of your automatic body function. So everything that's not your consciously controlled voluntary skeletal muscle will fall under the autonomic system. So it consists of motor neurons that innervate the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So again, things that we don't have control over. Helps make adjustments to assure optimal support for body activity. So like when you're exercising, it's able to redirect blood to areas that need it more, as well as adjusting your heart rate, blood pressure, digestive processes, etc. And again, it's subconscious control. So we are not aware of the autonomic system when it's working, but we are aware of it when it's not working. So comparing and contrasting the autonomic system versus the somatic skeletal system. So both contain motor fibers, but a few differences. So they differ in their effectors. So somatic nervous system is going to affect the skeletal muscles. Right? Autonomic nervous system affects the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands. They're also going to differ in their efferent pathways or their outgoing pathways. So the somatic system has a single neuron. Right? So we have one continuous chain from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle, the effector organ. Whereas the autonomic system, we have a two neuron chain. So we have a preganglionic axon and a postganglionic axon. So we have kind of a relay of our message. They're also going to differ in how their target organs respond to the neurotransmitters or the chemical messengers they release. So in the somatic system with skeletal muscle, it always releases acetylcholine and it always stimulates skeletal muscle contraction. We'll see with the autonomic system, these neurotransmitters could have a stimulatory effect or an inhibitory effect, depending on the neurotransmitter, depending on the type of receptors, depending on the type of organ. So there is some overlap between these two branches of the peripheral nervous system. So our higher brain centers can regulate and coordinate both systems. It can influence both somatic and autonomic systems. And as we looked at in Chapter 13, some of our spinal and cranial nerves have both somatic and autonomic fibers. So some of the cranial nerves that sent impulses are innervated the skeletal muscle in the tongue, as well as some of the salivary glands. Right? So that would be somatic and autonomic function. And generally, our body adaptations are usually going to involve both skeletal muscles and visceral organs. So even though there's two different systems, they are going to work hand in hand. So an example, if you're exercising, so you're consciously telling your skeletal muscles to contract, right, and move, they're going to require more oxygen and energy, glucose. So then the autonomic nervous system can speed up the heart rate and open the airways to get more oxygen and more blood to those skeletal muscles. So there's two divisions of this autonomic system. So we have the Parasympathetic Division, which is sometimes referred to as rest and digest. So this is going to promote your maintenance functions and conserve energy. The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight. So this is going to mobilize your body during activity. So most organs have what's called a dual innervation. So all of your visceral organs are going to be served by both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, but they're going to have opposite effects. So what one does, the other does the opposite. So this dynamic antagonism is what helps maintain homeostasis. So there's always kind of a tug of war between these two systems. So whichever one is pulling the hardest, right, will have the influence over that organ at that time. So looking at the parasympathetic division, so we said it's the rest and digest. So it helps keep the body energy use low as possible. So during your maintenance activity, so like digesting, diuresis or urination, defecation. Right? So again, rest and digest. So these are non-urgent activities. Right? Whereas the sympathetic division, your fight or flight, is going to mobilize the body during activity. So exercising, excitement, emergency, all of these activate the sympathetic system. So increases the heart rate, can dilate the pupils, increases respiration rate. And then during exercise or vigorous physical activity, right, when the skeletal muscles of the somatic system are working and have a higher energy demand, the sympathetic system can reroute blood to those muscles and the heart, as well as speed up the heart. So we have more blood flowing. We can dilate the bronchioles and the airways, so we can get more air into the lungs. We can also stimulate the liver to release glucose, so those muscles can use that sugar for energy as they're working. So some key anatomical differences between the two systems. So number one is sites of origin. So where do the parasympathetic nerves originate and where do the sympathetic nerves originate? Parasympathetic fibers are considered craniosacral, meaning they originate from the brain stem area as well as the sacral area. Sympathetic fibers are thoracolumbar. So they originate in the thoracic region and the lumbar region, right? So kind of the mid portion of the spine. They also differ in the relative length of fibers. So parasympathetic would have a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic. Right? So remember we said the autonomic system differed from the somatic system in that it uses that 2 neuron chain. So we have kind of that relay system. So in parasympathetic, that first neuron coming from the central nervous system is the longer of the two. So in the sympathetic system, it's going to be the opposite. So it has a short preganglionic and a longer postganglionic. And then the third difference is the location of the ganglia. So the ganglia is just where these fibers are going to relay that information. So in parasympathetic system, the ganglia are pretty much right at that effector organ. Right? So we had the short postganglionic, so it's pretty much already right there at the organ. Whereas in the sympathetic system, the ganglia are closer to the spinal cord in what's called the sympathetic trunk. So the postganglionic fibers would extend further from the spinal cord to their effector organs. So looking at the parasympathetic division, we said it's sometimes called the craniosacral because these fibers originate from the cranial region, the brainstem, and the sacral region at the base of the spine. It has the long preganglionic fibers that are going to extend pretty much right up to their target organs. And then they have shorter postganglionic fibers that are going to then synapse or connect to the effector organ. So looking at the cranial part of the parasympathetic system, so this is going to basically coincide with those cranial nerves that we talked about in the last section. So the cell bodies for these are located within the brainstem, so they're going to originate in the brainstem. And then these preganglionic fibers are going to run through those cranial nerves. So we have the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. And we said one is the eye mover, so it's going to innervate the muscles of the eye. And the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, is going to stimulate some of the glands in the head region, so like the salivary glands and lacrimal glands. Glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 9, right? It's going to stimulate some more salivary glands, right? And then the vagus nerve, we said that one was a little different because it's the only one that actually extends beyond the head and neck region. So it accounts for majority of our preganglionic parasympathetic fibers in the body, just because it's connected to virtually every major organ in the body. It serves all the thoracic and the abdominal viscera, so the lungs, the heart, the liver, stomach. The sacral part of the parasympathetic division is going to originate from S2 to S4. It's going to serve these pelvic organs in the lower portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity, so the reproductive organs, the bladder, the kidney, as well as that distal or far end portion of the large intestine. The sympathetic division, fight or flight, is more complex because it innervates more organs than the parasympathetic. So we said that most organs have this dual innervation, but there are some structures that are innervated only by sympathetic fibers. So things like sweat glands in the skin, arrector pili muscles in the hair follicles, some smooth muscle in blood vessels, right, or have only sympathetic impulse. And again, sometimes sympathetic is called the thoracolumbar division because it spans from the thoracic through the lumbar section of the spinal cord. So the sympathetic division is going to form from these lateral horns of the spinal cord, and then those preganglionic fibers pass through the white rami communicantes. So this white fiber here, so kind of a bridge between the main highway and some of these back roads. Right? So it enters the sympathetic trunk, right, or this chain, sympathetic chain of ganglia. Right? So remember the ganglia, these little knob-like swellings were where we had these cell bodies. Right? So a lot of information transfer happening through here. Right? Right? So again, another example showing our sympathetic preganglionic neuron. Remember we said those were shorter, right, on the preganglionic and longer on the postganglionic. So it's pretty much going to exit from the spinal cord and then just enter into that sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk. Right? Then from there, the postganglionic will go to the effector organ. So there's 23 ganglia within the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain. So there's 3 in the cervical region, 11 throughout the thoracic, 4 in the lumbar, 4 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And again, showing the red fibers are the preganglionic neurons, so pretty much from the lateral horns of the spinal cord into the sympathetic trunk. Right? So the short preganglionic and the black are the long postganglionic. So they're going to extend throughout the body to their final target organs. So major neurotransmitters used in the autonomic nervous system are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So acetylcholine is the same that we've already discussed with the somatic motor neuron. Right? It's released by what are called cholinergic fibers. So cholinergic, so choline being the root word, right, just tells us that it releases acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is going to be released by all of the preganglionic fibers, right? So in both sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's going to release acetylcholine first. And then the parasympathetic will release it again with their postganglionic. The sympathetic system is going to release norepinephrine by adrenergic fibers for its postganglionic. So norepinephrine and epinephrine, common name for them are adrenaline, right? So think of what it feels like when your adrenaline is pumping, your heart's racing. So norepinephrine is similar to adrenaline. So we get adrenergic, so adrene being the root word here, and then nephrine being kind of related to that there to help tie the two together. So acetylcholine for cholinergic and norepinephrine for the adrenaline, right? Adrenergic. So norepinephrine is released by almost all of the sympathetic postganglionic axons, exception of some of those at the sweat glands that can release acetylcholine. So the effect that these neurotransmitters have is going to depend on what type of receptor it binds to. So depending, does it bind to a cholinergic receptor or an adrenergic receptor? So there's 2 main types of these cholinergic receptors that can bind acetylcholine, nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. So these are just named after drugs that mimic acetylcholine and can bind to them. So think of the effects of nicotine. Muscarine is a mushroom poison. So nicotinic receptors are found on all of your postganglionic neurons. So in both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Nicotinic receptors are also found on the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla is a major hormone-releasing organ in the body. Also, the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscles at the neuromuscular junction. So all of these can respond to acetylcholine. So the effect of acetylcholine at these receptors is always stimulatory. Okay? So acetylcholine always stimulates skeletal muscle. Right? So nicotinic receptors are always going to have stimulating effects. So remember, acetylcholine basically stimulates by opening those sodium ion channels. So we cause that depolarization that initiates that action potential or that electrical impulse generation. Muscarinic receptors are found on all the effector cells that are stimulated by the postganglionic cholinergic fibers. So the effect of acetylcholine at these particular receptors can be inhibitory or excitatory. So remember, nicotinic receptors were always stimulatory, always exciting. Right? Muscarinic receptors can be either or, so it depends on what type of receptor on the target organ. So, for instance, if we bind acetylcholine on skeletal muscle, right, it's going to stimulate it. It's going to speed up the function and the action of that muscle. If we bind acetylcholine to cardiac muscle, it's going to slow the heart rate, right, and inhibit their contraction. There's two major classes of adrenergic receptors that are going to respond to this norepinephrine or epinephrine, aka adrenaline. So you have your alpha receptors and the beta receptors. And then they're divided into even more subclasses, A1, A2. But the effects depend on the type of receptor that's on the organ. So an example, norepinephrine binds to cardiac muscle via B1, beta 1 receptors, right? So these are located on the myocardium, the heart muscle. When binding to norepinephrine, it's going to increase the heart rate, increase the force of contraction, right? Whereas in beta 2 cells, or beta 2 receptors, located in the bronchial tubes, right? So in the lungs, can cause bronchodilation. So it can relax the lungs. So it would have a stimulatory effect on B1 receptors on the heart, but it would have a relaxing effect on beta 2 receptors in the lungs. So like we said, most of these visceral organs have kind of this dynamic antagonism, this dual innervation. So kind of this constant tug of war between the parasympathetic and sympathetic interactions. So homeostasis is the balance between these two branches. Both are basically constantly sending impulses. They're always working. It's just which one is sending stronger impulses during that time. So they can kind of pinpoint exactly the control level of our visceral activity. Because both systems are always at least partially active and functioning, we have what's called a sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. So basically just means that all of our muscles and glands are partially stimulated, so they'd be ready to respond if needed. But typically one division is going to predominate. So this dynamic antagonism allows for more precise control of our visceral activity. So sympathetic nervous system can increase the heart rate and respiration rate while dampening and slowing down digestive activities. Right? So fight or flight, if you are running for your life, right, digesting your lunch can wait. We're going to shift our energy to escaping or fighting off an attacker. So the parasympathetic division would be the opposite. So it's going to decrease or lower heart rate and respiratory rate to allow digestion to occur. So looking at sympathetic and parasympathetic tones, like we said, both systems are always constantly active. It's mainly just one is more active than the other at different times. So almost all of our blood vessel, smooth muscle is entirely innervated by these sympathetic fibers that are constantly active and firing. So we said the sympathetic had a few special organs that only it controls. So there's smooth muscle in the blood vessels, the sweat glands, and the arrector pili. Right? So even during rest, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be controlling the smooth muscle in the blood vessels. So sympathetic tone is just kind of a continual state of partial constriction in the blood vessels because it's always active, it's always sending at least partial weak signals. We have kind of this weak slight contraction. So if blood pressure starts to drop, then we'll just send the sympathetic impulses faster. So we'll increase the degree of constriction in the blood vessel and help to increase the blood pressure. Vice versa, if blood pressure gets too high, we can just dial back our sympathetic impulse transmission to let the blood vessels relax a little bit more. So this is how the sympathetic nervous system helps to redirect blood where it's needed. This parasympathetic division normally dominates heart and smooth muscle in the digestive system, like the urinary tract, and activates most of the glands, with the exception of the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are what secrete that adrenaline or that epinephrine. So the parasympathetic system being opposite of fight or flight, so aka rest and digest, is going to slow the heart rate, it's going to stimulate digestive activity. So just how the blood vessels exhibited that sympathetic tone from constant stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system, the digestive system is going to have a parasympathetic tone. So it's going to constantly be receiving at least some impulses from the parasympathetic nervous system. But again, the sympathetic system, being fight or flight, being more kind of urgent in life or death, can override this parasympathetic in times of stress. There were a few unique structures that are only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So the adrenal medulla, the sweat glands, arrector pili muscles, the kidneys, and the blood vessels. Some other unique functions of the sympathetic nervous system include a thermoregulatory response to heat. So because they control blood vessel diameter and blood pressure, if body temperature rises, we can dilate the blood vessels and let some of that heat escape through the skin. We can also activate the sweat glands. So those are our primary thermoregulatory mechanism, and they are innervated by the sympathetic system. Vice versa, if body temperature gets too low, the blood vessels can constrict. So this is why when it's cold outside, your fingers can go numb after a while, because the sympathetic nervous system is rerouting the blood to your core and your abdominal organs, your vital organs. The sympathetic nervous system can also stimulate the release of renin from the kidneys. So this is just an enzyme that's going to activate a system that increases blood pressure. So we'll talk about this renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism a lot in 2114, so I'll save that for another day. The sympathetic nervous system can also elicit some metabolic effects. So it can increase the metabolic rates of cells and cause them to take up more energy more efficiently. It can also raise blood glucose levels. So it can tell the liver to release glucose so the skeletal muscles can use them. We can also mobilize our fat stores for fuel. So again, sympathetic is fight or flight. So you're running for your life, you're fighting for your life, right? According to your brain anyway. So we need to tap into every resource we can just to get through this event and survive. Parasympathetic division tends to have shorter, more localized control over its effectors. More short-term because that acetylcholine is quickly degraded by the enzyme acetylcholine esterase. So once acetylcholine has done its job, we're going to break it down and clean it up from the area. Whereas sympathetic division tends to have longer lasting, more body-wide effects. So this works similar to kind of the hormones effect. So it travels through the bloodstream. So another reason is that norepinephrine is inactivated more slowly than acetylcholine, so it just takes longer to break it down, so it hangs around in your system for longer. These hormones can have prolonged effects that last even after the sympathetic signals stop. So the autonomic nervous system is ultimately under control by the central nervous system in the brainstem, the spinal cord, the hypothalamus, and the cortex, your conscious brain. So the hypothalamus is generally that main integrative system of autonomic nervous system activity. So it's kind of considered the boss. So it sets the thermostat for what your body temperature should be. It sets what certain hormone levels should be, what certain blood chemical levels should be, right? And make sure that everything stays within those parameters. Some cerebral input may modify autonomic nervous system, but it would still be kind of subconsciously. So maybe through the limbic system. So something that triggers an emotional response or maybe a fearful response through the amygdala can trigger some of those sympathetic reactions.